we're in the third week of our Lessons from the Desert series. And in this series, we've been using the wanderings of Israel between Egypt and the Promised Land as kind of a metaphor for how do we deal with life when we're between where we were and where we would like to be. When we're in that middle spot where things just aren't really going the way we want them to go, where things aren't happening the way we should. Most of you have been through one of these times. We call them desert times. Now, what I found is when you're going through desert times, if you let people know, they want to help you. Okay? Now, one of the ways they help you is by giving you outstanding advice on Facebook. Okay? Now, have you ever had this kind of stuff? The problem is not the problem. The problem is your attitude about the problem. Okay? Or how about this one? Never let a bad day make you feel like you have a bad life. When it rains, look for rainbows. When it's dark, look for stars. Sorry. Just consider the bad times a down payment for the good times. If you are alive, you have a reason to be happy. If things are really bad, they can only get better. It could be worse. Now, not particularly helpful, are they? Now, sometimes your friends are more holy than that. So they give you better advice. And they say things like this: when God closes a door, He opens a window. If God brings you to it, He will bring you. Yeah, you've all heard that one before. You're never more safe than when you're in God's will. Or how about this one? Let go and let God. Everybody knows that one. God will not give you more than you can handle. Now, I understand, and you understand, maybe you've used some of these. They mean well, right? Maybe you've used these before. You've certainly heard a lot of these before. Some of them have a little bit of truth in them. Some of them are blatantly false and not helpful. But when you're in the middle of a desert season, this kind of stuff doesn't really make it better, does it? I mean, not for me, at least. I see these things, I'm like, okay, whatever, right? You don't know my situation. You don't know me. And in fact, if you look at some of these, they actually raise questions, right? I look at these questions, I go, well, hold on a second. Things are pretty lousy. I must not be in the center of God's will because He isn't working anything out for me. You know what? This does feel like a lot more than I can handle. In fact, the last time I let go and let God, it didn't work out so well, right? So we kind of get into these. I mean, it's not very helpful. And we can get very, very frustrated in the middle of this. Have you ever watched a child who gets really frustrated? I don't mean like when they don't get their way necessarily, but if you've ever watched a young toddler who's trying to communicate, they want to get something across, and the adults around them or the people are not understanding them. You ever seen this? Right? And they finally just blow up. They get so angry and so frustrated because they're trying so hard to be understood and no one's getting it, and they just have a meltdown, right? They finally get so frustrated because they just want people to get what I'm saying, right? You're like, I'm sorry, honey, I don't understand, right? When we're adults and we're in the middle of the desert, it can feel the exact same way because we just get so frustrated. We're like, I don't care about all these things you're saying. It's not getting better. And what we saw last week was that can come out in complaining. But what we saw was that as we slide into that easy to slide into that negative, mistrustful place where we blame others, we forget about God, and we saw that was really unhealthy for us. So, what do you do? What do you do with all those feelings, all those emotions, all those things that are kind of going through your mind when you're in that? Now, we've said from the very beginning that the desert is this fertile place for transformation. When we're in those desert spots, we are going to be transformed one way or another, positively or negatively. So how do we make that positive when everything that's going through our head is negative, right? You know, when you're do we just bury the thoughts, put on a happy face? How you doing? Fantastic. Is that what we do? Or do we just try and hang on? Do we just try and soldier through? Do we just really try and find a logical reason of why? Someone once said that, this was their opinion, but they said that most midlife crises are simply an accumulation of unprocessed disappointments. And the reason that people go into these is because they had a vision early in their life. They had a vision about what family was going to be like and what marriage was going to be like and what work was going to be like and how they were going to contribute to God's kingdom. And they had all these things and they work hard at it and they pour their lives into it. And at some point, you go, it's not turning out exactly the way I thought it would. I mean, marriage is fine, but there's some disappointments there. My kids are good, but there's some things I was so hoping that they would be different. Our finances, we're not broke, but man, we are not where I thought we'd be. Yeah, I've done some good things in the church, but man, I thought I'd be a lot more impactful than I was. And so what happens is we get into these spaces, and whether it's a long, drawn-out accumulation of disappointments or one big desert because of something that's happened, when we don't process our emotions, our negative emotions in the midst of this, it can be very damaging to our soul. And that's because, this picture is, our passion, the things that we're very passionate, runs towards the things that we have vision for, things that we want to see happen, right? You know this. When you get excited about something, when it's something you want to see happen, you're just passionate about it, right? You have an idea and you're pursuing it. And you're so passionate, you're pouring your energy into it, and you do that. When we're in the desert, we begin to have disappointments, and our vision for what could kind of gets diminished because our goals aren't being reached. And so all that passion that we wanted to have is now, it can't go in the way we want. And so what happens is it ends up getting misdirected. And what often will happen is we will direct it towards, illicit things, because we just want to feel again. We want to feel like we used to. We want to have some of that juice. And so we just kind of dive into things that really we shouldn't be diving into. Or we don't do that, but we just get bitter and disillusioned. And we're angry, and our passion just kind of subsides. And maybe it's not either of those. Maybe you just say, well, you know what? I'll just try and live the best life I can, I guess. I'll try and be a good person and get whatever solace I can from life, and Jesus no longer becomes your first love. We're just living. We have to process all that uncertainty, the worry, the anger, the frustration when we're in desert times. And there is a spiritual practice that has been in play for thousands of years, and it's one that's been useful for a lot of people, and it's the practice I want to talk about this morning, and it's the lament. So, what is a lament? Now, I know what I picture growing up when I heard the word lament. It usually involved death. Right? If you picture a lament, you picture people wailing, they're mourning over someone. It evoked this images of weeping aloud, being very bitter and very loud. It was, in my mind, very uncomfortable. In fact, I actually almost always picture this happening in someone else's country, right? Like when I hear the word lament, I picture something over in the Middle East. Like I don't necessarily picture a good, Anglo-American funeral, because we don't do that here, right? That's what was going through my mind. But in fact, here's what the dictionary says about a lament. It's just a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. And so in Scripture, when we read about someone lamenting, it's just regret or sorrow or grief about something. It doesn't have to be death. It could be anything that's not the way it should be. They're in the desert. And what's interesting, even though that was my picture in my head about other cultures, the reality is that is actually true. You know that? Eastern cultures lament way better than we do. North Americans, Europeans are really bad at this because we live in a comfort-based society. We don't like the discomfort of laments. We'd rather numb it or just find something that makes us feel better. We just don't lament well. No one ever taught me how to lament when I was younger. But we can use this tool because, here's the cool part. I didn't put it up here. I want you to remember this, and I'll bring it up again later, is that when we lament, it actually leads to spiritual intimacy with God. Lamenting actually is a tool that will actually take us deeper with God if we do it well. And so that's what we want to talk about this morning. So last week, we're going to go right back into, we're talking about Israel. They're wandering in the desert. They're between Egypt and they're between the Promised Land. We're actually going to be, for those that want to follow along, in Numbers chapter 11 today. But just to catch you up, If you remember, we left Egypt, Israel left, God pulled them out, brought all these miracles, and then they began this pattern of complaining. We saw this last week, right? After they came through the Red Sea, they're all excited, they wrote songs about it. Then they had nothing to drink and they complained. Then they had nothing to eat, so they complained again. God gave them manna. Then they had nothing to drink again, so they complained, and God gave them water from a rock, right? They're kind of doing this pattern. And then they finally come to Sinai, where the famous mountain, that's where God meets Moses. He gives them the 10 Commandments. He gives them the law. It does not get better. If you remember the story, Moses goes up. He's up there for over a month, and the people say, he must be dead because, look, he went up into that cloud with that. God, I'm sure God killed him, so you know what? Let's do something else. And they made a golden calf. Remember? They bowed down to it. They started to party. Now, there was a whole thing. And so, Moses comes down. They have a whole bunch of stuff kind of happens around. He has to go back up and get the next 10 commandments because he broke the last ones because he was so angry. And now, after a couple months in Sinai, they've kind of got everything set. They've got the law. And Moses said, all right, God's leading us on. And so they leave out from Sinai. They're going to continue on to the promised land, but they have not learned their lesson at all. Because in Numbers 11, the first 3 verses, we read that they complained again about how tough their life was, how miserable it was. And God begins to up the stakes a little bit. Because if you remember the first 3 times they complained, he just gave them food. He gave them water. This time we read that when he complains, God started to send fire to burn people up at the edge of the camp. And the people had to come to Moses and say, we asked Moses, please pray for us. And so Moses does, and God stops. And you would think they would get it. And we come and start at verse 4. The rabble with them, I think that's a very interesting term, began to crave other food. In other words, they're getting manna every day. They're getting enough to eat, sustaining them. And again, the Israelites started wailing, and they said, if only we had had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Yet they were slaves. Okay, that was the cost, right? But they'd forgotten about this. Also, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, garlic. But now we've lost our appetite because we've never seen anything but this manna. Interesting. The manna, and the author kind of takes a little side here, tells us here's what it looked like. The manna was like coriander seed and looked like resin. The people went around, they gathered it, and then they ground it in a hand mill or crushed it in a mortar. They cooked it in a pot, they made it into loaves, and it tasted like something made with olive oil. When the dew settled down in the camp at night, the manna also came down. Sounds good, but they don't like it. And we read, Moses heard the people of every family wailing at the entrance of their tent. Now, got to pause here. This is not a good situation. God is providing miraculously this manna every single day, but they're angry. They're unhappy. And they're focusing their anger on Moses. Their anger, their ire, they're like, this is your problem. We're tired of this food. We want something else. You can only eat pizza every day for a certain amount of time, and then you want something else, right? Some of you are like, no, I could eat pizza every day. Well, right? This is heavenly bread, but they're tired of it. Is there anything we got? Moses, you're the reason we're here. We want to see something else happen. And then we read this. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. I mean, you got to put yourself in Moses' shoes here to really get the impact of this, because we can read by this so fast. He's now questioning everything he ever did and everything he ever heard from God. You're wondering, did I even hear from God in the first place? The burning bush seemed like a long time ago. You're thinking, you know what? Life was pretty peaceful back then. I didn't have to do this. I didn't have to deal with these people. And you're seeing God's miracles, and that's cool, but you're balancing this against 100 or 200,000 people complaining at you all the time. And think about it. He was struggling with people who were speaking about him behind his back. And he's struggling with people who were saying these things to his face, in his hearing. There's opposition. I mean, you got your brothers and your sister, your family, but nobody else. Everywhere he goes, there's accusing stares, people whispering, stony faces, angry faces. They're questioning his abilities, his character. They're even questioning who this God is that Moses said that they serve. Moses would rather be anywhere than with these people. And so we read, Moses was troubled. Yeah, I guess so. And this is not just casually bothered. This is not just one of those things where he's like, oh, I'm this kind of casual, I'm a little bit depressed. Listen to what it says next. This will give you a window into what Moses was feeling. And we're going to look at what he did with his feelings. He asked the Lord, why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms, as a nurse carries an infant, to the land that you promised on oath to their ancestors? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, give us meat to eat. I can't carry all these people myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. If I have found favor in your eyes, kill me. And do not let me face my own ruin. Moses is on the edge of emotional collapse. Because the desert is fertile ground for emotional collapse. That's what happens. And if you think this is exaggerated, you just got to look at the imagery, right? This is someone who, if we were having the conversation, we'd say, you need to talk to a counselor now, because you're talking about death, like suicide, about killing yourself, of wanting to be dead. This is not just a little thing. Moses is at the end of his rope. He's got nothing left. He's frustrated with the task. He's frustrated with the people. He's frustrated with the lack of resources. He's so desperate, he literally cannot see any way out of where he's at. He's gone. He'd rather be dead. Done, gone, finished. But he does something in here that's really, really important, that changes things for him. In his feelings of all this, he laments. And it's actually a vehicle towards spiritual intimacy. So what is the lament? If we're going to do this, if we're going to build this into our lives, and some of you have done this, a lot of you probably have never lamented, really. You kind of are familiar with the term, you've heard it in church, but you don't really know what it looks like. What is a lament? If we're going to do this well, because it actually helps us, what does it look like? Well, I think there's three things that come out of this from looking at Moses. Here's the first one. Laments begin with unfiltered honesty. And so a lament is when we turn to God and we're not holding anything back. It's raw, uninhibited prayer. It's coming to God, and think about it. Moses is speaking to the author of life, the God he met on the mountain, the God of his ancestors, and he is holding nothing back. And he fires this whole set of questions at God. What did I do? Right? You ever had one of those? Your kid's like, what did I do? I didn't do anything. Here's what he's saying to God. What did I do? Come on, I didn't choose this. This was you. I mean, you put this burden on me. What is going on? Did I conceive these people? I mean, they're not mine. They're not my family. I didn't give birth to these people. Like, God, what are you doing? You're telling me to carry them to the promised land? I can't do that. Where am I supposed to get meat for all these people? Do you see? He's not holding back. He's not saying, okay, well, God, I'm not really happy right now, and I don't want to speak bad about them. None of that, right? He is just laying it out. These people are terrible. I don't want to be around them. I can't stand leading them. It's your fault because you stuck me with them. None of you ever felt like that, right? And he finishes with a statement, I can't go on like this, you might as well kill me. I mean, this is raw, unfiltered, unflinching honesty. And you can hear, because there's this undercurrent of blame, of accusations that he's making against God. This is your fault, God. For a lament to be effective, it has to be honest and unfiltered. And you see this pattern all the way through Scripture. Do you remember Elijah? When he had his showdown with the prophets of Baal, and the fire comes down, he has this amazing thing, and then the queen says, I'm going to kill you, and he has to run for his life. Do you remember what he did? He was afraid, he ran for his life, and when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. He went on a journey into the wilderness, and he came to a broom tree, sat under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said, take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. He laid down under the bush and fell asleep. Or think about Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a guy who spoke God's word. He was obedient. He said incredibly unpopular things because God told him to. And his reward from God was to be beaten, put in the stocks, publicly humiliated, thrown in a pit. His life was in danger. And Jeremiah says, cursed be the day I was born. I wish I had never existed. May the day my mother bore me not be blessed. Why did I ever even come out of the womb? Why am I born? to see trouble and sorrow and end my days in shame. Raw, unfiltered honesty. My friends, God knows what you're feeling anyway. He gets your emotions. He knows what's going through your heads. He understands the feelings and the thoughts and the challenges in the desert better than you do. And even though He knows it, we need to come raw and unfiltered to Him, not for His benefit, but for ours. It needs to be expressed. It needs to come out. We need to tell God. It's not so that He can find out. It's so we can put words to what is going on inside of us. When we lament, we can be totally clear on what we're thinking and feeling. That's okay. In fact, it's encouraged. It's the biblical way to lament. But if we wanted to lead us to greater spiritual intimacy and not just move into complaining, which we talked about last week, there's a second component. And here's what it is. Laments turn towards God instead of complaining about Him. Now, it's very interesting. When you read what Moses said at first, it kind of sounds like a complaint, doesn't it? Like I'm complaining about these people and everything that happened and what you're asking of me. It kind of has that flavor to it. But the key difference between the Israelites' complaints and Moses' lament is that the Israelites were complaining about God, where Moses is praying to God. In despair, Moses actually turns towards God. The direction of a lament is always God. Right? It's raw, unfiltered honesty. It's not pulling any punches, but the direction, where we're going with it, is towards God, not sideways to Him, not away from Him, but towards Him. It's turning directly in His way. It's not speaking to ourselves. It's not even talking to other people. It's talking to God. It's facing God head on and laying it all out, saying, God, this is what's going on. See, Moses, he doesn't argue with the people. Do you notice that? Even though he had the moral high ground, you don't see him trying to justify himself in front of the people. He doesn't get into a fight to prove himself. He doesn't retreat and just go escape into more fun activities like, okay, I'm out. You guys are on your own, right? I'm going back to where I came from. He doesn't walk away, even though that's what he wanted to do. We read that he asked the Lord. Do you see that? It didn't say he told the Lord. It said he came to the Lord with all those complaints and all those issues and all those problems because he was asking, God, what is going on? This is what I feel. This is what's going on. I don't get it. Please engage with me because I'm being overwhelmed. Now, the idea of a lament actually is not unknown. You know, you see this in modern songs all the time, right? Look at this. This is a song from Pearl Jam. It's a hopeless situation. I'm starting to believe that this hopeless situation is what I'm trying to achieve. I try to run on. It's all or none. Or how about this one? Demi Lovato. You have a hollowed out heart, but it's heavy in your chest. I tried so hard to fight it, but it's hopeless, hopeless. You're hopeless. This is not uncommon. People, the difference with those and what we're reading in the Bible is that there's no hope. A biblical lament has hopefulness to it. Michael Card, who is a Christian songwriter, said this: biblical lament never loses sight of God. It's always a prayer to God. The character of lament for us is different because we don't mourn as those who have no hope. Ironically, do you know that it's very difficult to find laments in worship music? Do you know that? Think of all the songs that we sing on a Sunday. Their adoration, their praise, their worship. It is really hard in Western culture to find a lament. And yet, God's saying, this is a good thing. You need to lament. But it's not because you're complaining. You're being raw and you're being unfiltered and you're being honest. But you're directing it to me. I'm the object of that. I'm the person you're engaging with. And so that leads us to the third part of we want lament to be redemptive, to actually cause reflection and contemplation, to have spiritual intimacy grow. Then have to lead us to this hopeful dialogue with God. Remember, lament is the exercise. We're acquainting God with what we feel, not because we need to tell Him, not because He needs to know something, but because we want to begin a conversation with God that opens us up to what He has to say. That's what a lament does. A lament says, okay, God, Moses isn't just spouting off some diatribe, and when he's done, he's like, all right, I'm out, shakes his fist, walks away. God, you're terrible, and I'm done with you. That's not what it is. It says he asked. He came to God. He said, I want to start a conversation with you. It's miserable. I don't understand why I'm in this. I don't understand why my family's like this. I don't understand why my kids are going that way. I don't understand where this malaise and all this depression comes from. I don't understand how to deal with the disappointments. I don't know how I went from kids to an empty nest, and now I'm feeling empty, and I don't understand what to do with it. Whatever it is, God's saying, okay, let's have a conversation. Bring it to me. Tell me everything it is, but direct it to me, and then let's talk about it. It's very interesting. Right after Moses has this whole conversation, we read this. So the Lord engaged with Moses. He heard all that. He said, here's Moses, show what you do. I want you to bring me 70 of Israel's elders. They're known to you as leaders. In other words, go to the people that you already know are leaders. They're officials among the people. I want you to come, bring them all to the tent of meeting where we're going to gather, the common place, the worship center of Israel. I want you to bring them there, that they may stand there with you. And I'm going to come down, and I'm going to speak with you there. Look at this. He says, I'm going to speak to you, Moses. I mean, we're already talking about it. I'm going to speak to you there in front of all your leaders. And I'll take some of the power of the Spirit that's on you, and I'm going to put it on them. They're going to share the burden with you, with people, so that you don't have to carry this alone. I get it, Moses. I understand this. It's not all yours. I'm going to give you some help. And then, by the way, tell the people to consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow, because you're going to eat meat. The Lord heard you when you wailed, if only we had meat to eat. We were better off in Egypt. He says, now the Lord will give you meat, and you will eat it. Now, if you continue to read, he made them eat it every day for 30 days until they couldn't handle it anymore. It's a very interesting story. But do you catch what's going on here? Focus on Moses. Moses is in this place where he's like, I don't even know what to do with these. He feels isolated. He feels alone. He's in the desert. There's no one around. He says, no, hold on. Go get your leaders. I want you to come around. I'm going to speak with you. But I'm going to do it in front of them. Which means I'm going to elevate you, Moses. I'm going to actually put you in a place where they're going to see it. I'm actually going to put my Spirit on them. It turns out that when he did that, they prophesied. God's Spirit fell on them. He says, I'm actually going to support you. I'm going to actually answer the needs of these people, even though they're doing it through complaining. Moses, you're not alone. Now, I want you to understand, it didn't fix everything. They were still in the desert. It was still difficult. But Moses, all his complaints about being alone, that God was overwhelming, and God says, okay, I got you. There was a dialogue. There was some hope in this. See, when we're honest with God in a lament, what it does is it brings clarity to our own thoughts and feelings. Because when you write it down, you're like, oh, yeah, that's what I really feel. You know what? When I say it that way, that's what's really going on. Yeah, God, this is what's going on in my heart. This is what I'm feeling. And it brings us to a place where all of that's on the table. And God says, great. Now let's talk about it. Because until we're honest, until we put it all out there unfiltered, we can never hear God. Whether we're ashamed, we don't want to say it, we think there's something wrong with that. And sometimes when that happens, he puts us in a new direction. He says, all right, I heard you. I want you to go this way. Like he did with Moses. I'm going to go grab somebody. Sometimes he makes us aware of our own sins, our own deficiencies. Because we do all our lamenting, and God says, yeah, there's a reason that. There's an area of your life that you're not paying attention to. There's conviction. Sometimes he just meets us with encouragement. Just his presence. He gives us that spiritual hug and the feeling. And I wonder sometimes if our slowness to do this, to come to God, to lay it all out, is somehow anchored in this suspicion that God doesn't care that much. That he's actually unconcerned when nothing could be further from the truth. Because our view of God will decide whether we seek him in the middle of the desert or not. And if we see him as someone who's concerned and who cares, we are much more likely to say, all right, God, I don't see it right now, so we're going to have a conversation. And so Moses' prayer, it's honest, it's powerful. And a dialogue is started. And as you continue to read what happens, his intimacy with God just continues to go deeper. Now, this is not just, we're going to get a chance to practice this in a second. But this wasn't just Moses. If you read through the Psalms, if you're like, well, I don't even know how to lament, I wouldn't even know what to write, you know what you do? Is you read the Psalms till you come to one that reflects how you feel. And then just pray that. Okay? And there's this tiny pattern in all throughout the Scripture and the Psalms that follows what we just talked about. Let me give you an example. Psalm 13 is a great example of a lament. And this is very encouraging, by the way, because some of the people that we hold up as the greatest giants in the faith in Scriptures went through horrible desert times, and they lamented to God in the midst of all these things. That's why God sticks them in the Bible. So they're models for us. They're encouragement for us. So here's one of the examples. Psalm 13. Whoever's writing, and we think it's David, but we're not totally sure. He says, how long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? You can see, again, unfiltered honesty. He's just bringing it all to God. Like, I can't believe I'm in this situation. It feels like I have to do this forever. God, when are you going to finally step in? Right? He's being very honest with God. But then the psalm goes on. He starts turning towards God. It's not just honesty. He's bringing it to God. He's pointing in that direction. He says, look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say I've overcome him. My foes will rejoice when I fall, but I trust in your unfailing love. I don't see it, but I trust it. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he's been good to me. I don't even understand what's going on now. These are all my feelings, but you know what? You've been good in the past. God, and he begins this hopeful dialogue that ends with those verses. You have been good to me. So you can kind of see that same thing of this unfiltered honesty and lament that comes to God, but it's a dialogue. It's not a complaining about God. It's coming to God to say, this is what's going on. I don't get it. I'm going to put words to how I feel no matter what that looks like. Because sometimes when you tell God what you're really feeling, it uncovers your heart and you're like, ooh, that's what I really feel? Yeah, it is. He's not surprised. He never steps back in shock and goes, oh, I can't believe you said that to me. Right? That just never happens. He's like, yeah, I know. I needed you to say it. Because once you say it, now we can begin this dialogue that ends in hope. The Psalms are often filled that way, with laments. They have vivid pictures. They're timeless. So use language of Scripture. Borrow from them all the time. If you don't know what to do, there's Psalms in laments where they talk about drowning, right? And if you've ever been in a place where you thought you were drowning, there is vivid imagery that comes in your mind that allows you to say, yes, God, that's what I'm feeling. Use it. Use whatever is in Scriptures. Write it down. Say it verbally. Mold it to your situation. In the end, laments can actually lead us to spiritual intimacy and greater health in our souls. Because a lament basically is saying our hope for the future is anchored in the goodness of God in the past. And so I'm going to have a conversation with God that keeps that in mind. I wonder sometimes if desperate prayers of lament might actually be an indication of spiritual health, not spiritual deficiency.